This is Computing Up, conversations about computation writ large, with Michael Littman and Dave Ackley. This episode was recorded November 4th, 2020.
So it's the day after the election, and I think 100% of the country is really disappointed in the other 50% of the country.
Yeah.
So that adds up to 150% if I did that calculation correctly.
Well, it's about that much disappointment.
It feels like at least that much. My stomach is what finally figured it out. Like last night I was watching returns come in and I was thinking, this is fine. Why is my stomach so upset?
Yeah.
It's like, no. You're going to be sad soon. So I know with that in mind, I thought it would be super fun to have a conversation with Phil Menczer. So Phil, Dave and I first met Phil when he was a graduate student and I was a pre-graduate student.
Long time
all
ago.
Working on artificial life in one form or another. But Phil has gone on to work on information pollution, which I think is extremely exciting, extremely important, and hopefully somewhat timely. So, Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi. It's been a while.
It has been a real while.
It's so nice to talk with you.
No, thanks a lot for coming. So, how are things? Tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, and then let's talk a little bit about what you've been doing, like really recently.
Well, yeah, I'm keeping pretty busy. I'm interested in misinformation and disinformation to connect back to what I was doing decades ago that you mentioned about artificial life. There is a thread because in some ways our presence online is harder to distinguish from whether you're a human or you're a bot.
I see. On the internet, no one knows you're an artificial life form.
Everybody's halfway artificial on the internet.
And we're all somewhat cyborgs because we use tools, and also the online environment is itself a world on its own that has its own interesting dynamics, where you have ideas and concepts and information that spreads from person to person. You could think of it as reproducing, right? Remember Richard Dawkins' definition of the meme.
Sure.
Today, people just use the word meme just to mean pictures with captions, but back when we were playing together, we were, this was the meaning of the term, and we still use it that way. We look at these memes as if they were genes. They multiply, they mutate, they reproduce. Some of them they have very high fitness, and meaning that many people adopt them, and then they lead to offsprings, which are variations of, for example, of narrative stories, claims. They have their own interesting qualities. They may be interesting or relevant or false or reliable. And so there is an interesting universe, an artificial world in which we live, which also affects our real world, right? Because the information to which we are exposed online affects our behaviors, our voting, talking about the elections today. And in fact, people do try to manipulate this world to affect choices, to influence opinions for good and for bad. And so it's a really interesting universe in which to look at what agents do and how they behave and how they interact with each other. And we can extract a huge amount of data, digital traces about what people do online. So I'm interested in studying all of this, how information spreads, how it affects people, how this space can be manipulated through inauthentic actors, whether they are social bots or artificial life forms, or whether they're humans, or perhaps
liars.
A single sure. Also, you can have a single individual that actually controls a bunch of these entities, so that even though these entities are not artificial, they're also not authentic, right?
They're not independent, certainly. Yeah.
They're not independent. And so there is a very interesting ways in which these dynamics play into our own cognitive biases. We get the impression that a lot of different people are talking about something or believing something, where in fact that's one way that we can be manipulated, because those are not independent. They can be all controlled by a single entity. So there's a lot of interesting...
to this mode of feeling like if I hear it from multiple sources, it's more true. And so you're saying by manipulating the fact that people are hearing things from multiple sources, even though it's really one origination point, that actually has a significant impact on people's belief systems.
Exactly.
So can you this is super interesting. I actually hadn't made that connection. I figured you just moved into an area that
and gave up on artificial life.
Yeah, no. That's right. Moved on. So what was the transition? How did you slip from one to the other?
Oh yeah, there was actually a path. So for my dissertation, back in the 90s, that's when the web was happening, as you remember. And so we kind of looked at intelligent agents exploring the web and navigating from page to page. And I did my dissertation on intelligent adaptive crawlers that used, reinforcement learning or evolutionary learning or genetic algorithms to learn how to find interesting information. And so
I'm sorry. Wait. So you're saying that even all the way back to your dissertation, you were looking at online sort of information, so the crawlers like web crawlers,
yes.
And making sort of lifey, evolution-y inferences about them. I mean, so that's
right.
That's OG. I mean, you're way back there.
Yeah, that's right. At that time, we didn't have search engines yet, or at least not good ones like we have now. Google started in around 98, which is the time that I got my PhD. Right. And so the idea was to have people running their own smart crawlers, browsing the web and navigating the web graph, and then creating local indices, and then share them with others in a peer-to-peer network. And so the dissertation was on finding algorithms for these agents to find interesting stuff and adaptively learn which sections of the web would be more interesting and would have more information related to their interests. So from there, then the natural continuation was to look at the web itself as a complex world, as a complex structure. And so we started looking at the relationship between the network structure of the web and the content in the web, and how it is navigatable, how it is likely that, when you navigate from one page to another, you will find related information. And so that led me to, to the study of complex networks in general, especially information networks. And so when social media started appearing a few years later, it was a very natural place to look at data and look at another way in which you had networks of people and networks of information working together. Sure. And so that led us, to look at how information propagates from person to person. So it's kind of like the reverse problem. Instead of looking at how people navigate the information world, is how information navigates the social network of people, so the social world, and goes from person to person, and which is sort of the same problem, just looking at it from two different perspectives.
Well, I've been thinking about that more and more lately, that, it seems like it's just a metaphor or something like that memes or ideas are programs that run on us. But the more that I've been thinking about it, the more I think, that's probably, in the end, a better way to look at it, even though it kind of marginalizes us. We're just the hardware at some level. And
we're the host.
Yeah, exactly. And, what we really are is this combination of zillions of these programs and program fragments that interact with each other, and sometimes they come together and push in a unified direction, and sometimes they're scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, this is very much Dawkins's perspective, right? Not just on these information nuggets, but on genes themselves, right? That let's flip this around and think about that we're the vehicles for the genes, and not that genes, are somehow components of us.
Absolutely. And so these things get transmitted from person to person. The transmission process has become so efficient, right? So if you think of the evolution from the web to wikis, to blogs, to microblogs, to online social networks, to Web 2.0, the transition has always been in the direction of lowering the cost or the complexity for these whatever you want to call it, these memes, to be transmitted from one person to person. It is much easier for us to create them. It is easier for us to tweak them and mutate them. And it is easier for us to set them in the wild and to share them with other people so that they can go and invade other hosts, if we use this analogy. And so the good part of it, of course, is that if you have a great idea, it's easy for it to to propagate. Whether it's a scientific idea, whether it's a social movement, it's easy to find critical mass and affect real change. But in the same...
Yeah, though actually I think it privileges, at least the way that we have it set up now, it privileges certain kinds of messages over others. So like a rich, interesting, complicated, layered scientific idea is not... It doesn't benefit quite as much from this infrastructure as like a one-liner, right? A little zinger.
True. And this is, of course, has to do with how our own cognition interacts with these messages and how they play into our pre-existing biases and limitations of our brain in some sense. But the other aspect is not just about the complexity of these ideas, but also about whether these are really things that are spreading for good purposes, that they're real information, or whether these are just ways for one person or one entity to manipulate other people. So propaganda, of course, has always existed. Fake news have always existed, but now we have a machinery by which entities can reach an enormous amount of people and can have a big effect on them in a way that is hard to detect, because you don't know who's behind a Facebook page, you don't know who's behind an Instagram account or a Twitter account, and you can impersonate other people. You can use technology to amplify messages through fake accounts. You can create the appearance that an idea or a person is very popular. You can therefore trick people's propensities to, for example, believe something because they think that it, as you were saying earlier, that there is a crowd behind it, because we think that these sources are independent, and our brain has not evolved to think that there is a bunch of people out there that are false and that may be trying to influence us or trick us. So there is a lot of interesting dynamics.
So do we think that, so now with the internet, there's kind of like just, this gigantic switch that presents the potential for tremendous amplification, tremendous gain.
And to be clear, the switch in this case, you mean like a crossbar switch,
I mean,
right? Like everybody's connected to everybody.
like a mixing center where you go in, like
right.
FedEx, everything goes to Memphis and then it goes wherever it belongs. So every cat picture goes to Facebook and then it goes wherever it belongs. And what I'm wondering is okay, is that a change in quality, or is that the same in some fundamental way as the guy yelling in the village that he's the best, or whatever it is?
That's a very good question. I think there is a fundamental change. It used to be that you could reach a very limited number of people in some sense, right? And you could be exposed to a limited number of people. And so mediators, whether they were newspaper editors or politicians or whatever, they played a very important role into the kind of information that you might be exposed. They could act as gatekeepers. Now there are some downsides of that, of course.
Yeah.
But there are also positive sides in terms of filtering the and possibly, especially in terms of journalistic ethics standards that evolved over the last 100 years or so, at least in some parts of the world. Then there was an advantage of that, a filtering role. And so, as I was saying earlier, that as technology has evolved, it has lowered the threshold both for the production and for the consumption of information, so that now people can find their audiences and people can be reached from lots of different sources, and the gatekeepers have a much more limited role. They still play an important role. I mean, news organizations are still important, but less so. And so as a result of that, we are easier to manipulate because it's hard for the common person. It's harder to tell, is this a trustworthy source or not? Is this website better than this other website? They look flashy and authoritative, but yet one is run by a bunch of scientists and another one is run by a bunch of conspiracy theorists. And so it's a much more complex world where people have to weed through this enormous amount of information that is coming from all over the place, but they don't have the tools to do that.
So earlier you were using metaphors of reproduction and spread and kind of inhabiting hosts and so forth. Did, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Do you find that either the kind of work that you do is giving you a unique perspective on what we're all going through, or are you actually finding ways to contribute? Like, is there things that you can study about the situation that we're in right now?
That's an interesting question. People use models that are inspired by epidemic modeling and epidemic networks, also to study infodemics, or the propagation of information. And there are some very strong analogies. There are also differences. So for the simplest difference, for example, is that when we look at the diffusion of diseases, usually each contact has a chance of transmission, which is always the same. So if you sneeze and then you sneeze again after 5 minutes, after each of those sneezes, we have the same chance that that you transmit a cold to me if we're in the same room. More or less, or every time we shake our hands. But when we talk about information, there is a slightly different dynamic. The first time that I'm exposed to an idea is different from the second time and the third time. And eventually, if half of my friends, buy a new gadget or recommend a movie to me, I have a different response than when I just hear it the first time from somebody. And so some people refer to this as simple versus complex contagion. In complex contagion, the more times we are exposed to something, a behavior or an idea, or from the more people we are exposed to it, the more we're likely to respond to it or pay attention to it, or perhaps even adopt it and share it with our friends. So that's one fundamental difference. But in other ways, these two processes are similar. And so one thing that is particularly interesting to me, to answer your question, is the dynamics between the two. Okay, so for example, right now we live in a world where whether you get infected or not depends a lot on your behaviors and the behaviors of your friends. For example, whether you social distance, or whether you use a mask, or whether you decide to get the vaccine in a few months, hopefully when it will become available. However, at the same time, we have competing narratives about these same behaviors on our, that we see on our social media feed. And we have people saying that you should do these things, and other people who say that you shouldn't. And we have on one side, doctors who say yes, you should wear a mask, and then we see others that say no, actually the mask will make you more vulnerable, which is false, by the way, for your listeners.
Right.
And so the spread of information and misinformation about health issues, including pandemics, could then in turn have an effect on the spread of the biological disease itself. So, for example, we've seen, even before this pandemic, right, we saw outbreaks of measles in parts of the country where misinformation about vaccines was spreading rampantly among certain groups of people, maybe some ethnic minorities or certain groups of concerned parents, or maybe people with certain political beliefs, both on the right and on the left, by the way. And so to me, this interplay between the spread of information and misinformation about health and the spread of diseases is very interesting. And right now it's playing out in the wild as we speak. And we have behaviors such as, going to a rally or going to a party then affect people who get sick and die in some cases, unfortunately. So how these two pandemics or infodemics play with each other.
Certainly the networks. The networks are coupled in a really interesting way. I mean, interesting and horrifying. But and another difference I feel like is one that would resonate a lot with Dave, which is that the disease spread really is spatially,
Yes.
Right.
I don't know,
Yes.
embedded, right? Like you really do have to. So one thing I thought was super interesting is that when there are groups that are building, there are groups that are designing and testing vaccines against the virus, who the way that they got the virus was by email.
Right.
Right. So people sequenced the genome and then transmitted the genome in electronic form, and then are creating virus vaccines that are the virus, but they produced it by using the information that they got out of the computer. But mostly people are getting sick because they're actually in physical connection with each other. Whereas these information networks, at least we have this, shared delusion that they are outside of space.
And,
Well, go ahead.
And they're not, of course. I mean, the idea, and this is something that took me forever to come around to, that information is physical. It's actually represented in memory on disk someplace. When one idea is stored there, another idea cannot be. It takes up space. It just happens to be really, really light. Really, really very little mass required to do it, and very easy to copy faithfully, which again is much like living systems, much like viruses and so forth. They're very light. They're very easy to copy relatively faithfully and so forth. And Michael, just as you say, I mean, we could imagine down the road when everybody has the molecular sequencer sitting on their desk to make a hamburger for themselves, the thing could get hacked and they could be given a disease via their thing because the coupling...
a real biological disease transmitted through the information network.
Because the only thing that's keeping them separate at the moment is the output, the action mechanism to allow this information to have an impact of that sort on the physical world.
Well, and as Phil was
absolutely.
pointing out, like, you don't even need the generator. You don't need this, printer on the other side. If you can transmit ideas that cause people to go out without a mask, which sounds crazy, right? Like there's spiders that do this. Like you can infect the spider, and now the spider goes around and propagates the virus. But we're doing that. Like that's actually happening.
It is
to us. We're
happening.
getting talked into doing things that are helping spread the virus.
Yeah. Well, they're called political rallies these days. But sorry, I want to respond to a couple of things that you guys said, which really resonates. One is about the physicality of the transmission versus versus the less physical or less spatially constrained diffusion of information that Michael was talking about. To some degree, it's true. So certainly these two networks are not the same network. We can imagine that the nodes are the same. They're the people, for example. But the edges might be different. So in terms of physical connection, maybe they are the people that I interact with, that I live in the same town or go to school with or whatever. Whereas in the case of communication, I can easily talk to somebody in another continent. However, if you actually look at the geographic locality of social networks, you will find that it's very strong. So most of your friends are likely to live near you, even your online friends. And you have a smaller number of long-range connections with people who live far away from you. So
right. I mean, but in this sort of small world network kind of thing, those few long-range connections are hugely important.
Absolutely. But they also happen in the physical world where people travel on airplanes.
Right.
Less now, of course, exactly for this reason. But that's how pandemics happen, because viruses travel on planes. Through us, and so in some sense they're not that different from each other. They're not the same network, but there are some strong similarities. So an interesting problem that one of my students is working on is specifically on trying to account for the geographic structure of social networks, and as well as other types of homophily, right? Of factors that play into why two nodes in this network may be connected to each other. For example, because they share the same political beliefs, and so they're more likely to infect each other with some opinions or ideas. And then build models of these networks, and then look at how information or misinformation spreads on these models, and how it may affect then spreads of diseases in a local physical area, and to see if we can use that to predict geographic areas in which you will have outbreaks. So we have some interesting results and working paper on that. So that's, I think, a really interesting problem.
Yeah.
And then the second thing, I'm sorry, going back to what Dave was saying about the space that these memes, let's call them, occupy in our brain. I think there is a really interesting point from that, and that is the fact that we have a limited amount of attention, right? I mean, our brains are very powerful, but nevertheless, we can only pay attention to a certain number of things. But the technology that we use, overloads that attention, right? We follow thousands of people, and there is no way that we can possibly look at everything that is accessible to us. So our brain starts using tricks and cognitive shortcuts, and, for example, paying attention to things that seem popular, because we use signals from others to decide what's important and what's not important, and it can be tricked, right? And then platforms themselves use these signals to decide how to rank things and what to show us and what not to show us based on engagement, on popularity, and so on. And so all of these things turn out to be vulnerable. They can be gamed. And so then the space, from becoming just like a natural communication network in which we're talking with each other, it's one in which you also have bad actors that can overload it, can infiltrate it, and so that's the stuff that I'm most interested in these days, in seeing how these information ecosystem can be polluted or manipulated.
Is it clear? I mean, I sort of, one thing I think is that sort of as scientists, we have this truth bias. We believe that, number one, there is such a thing as truth, and number two, it's good, and number three, it can be distinguished from less or non-truth. And I'm sure that that's not really true on the margin, that there will always be gray areas. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that if you sort of look back to the state of nature and before language was sophisticated and all this, there really even was that much of a clear notion of truth. I mean, there was a, point at something, and if you manage to look at it, you might learn something that's useful to you, and that's about it. And so I wonder if there is a sort of more primitive way of looking at things that can't go all the way to bad actors, or it can't call them bad actors solely because we say they're not saying the truth, but that they're doing something that for some other reason, some other connection is somehow bad, immoral, unfair, hypocritical, something.
Yeah, I mean, think of animals that camouflage, right? We don't call them bad actors, but they are trying to trick other animals.
Yeah, exactly. How dare you went and look like a rock when you were really an octopus? That's so unfair.
But so they are not necessarily evil. They're just surviving. And so, the zebra can learn to survive when it starts running, when other zebras are running, because probably there is a signal there. Maybe one of those zebras has seen a lion in the bush, perhaps, or maybe not. But the fact is that the zebras that starts running are more likely to survive and reproduce than the ones that decide not to start running. Right. And so in this case, the signal does not need to be truthful, but as long as there is a correlation between some signal that is important and the behavior, that correlation can be learned and feed into survival mechanisms, right? And behaviors that and this is true, if you extend it to every kind of behavior that is evolved. We don't ask whether it's true or not. We don't when we look at camouflage or running away from your predator, we don't call it good or bad. It's just what lets you survive. And so right now there is a competition in our virtual world, because between the people who want to influence us, whether it's to make money or whether it's to win political elections or whatever it is, right? Money. There is that competition. And so you could think of the better idea will win, and better does not mean necessarily true. It's just the one that spreads and the one that affects the behavior and the one that lets you get fitness, whether your fitness is money or votes or whatever it is. So so I completely agree with you. This notion of truth or accuracy is something that is important to us scientists and to journalists, and and we assign high ethical value. But out there in the wild, and by wild now I could mean Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't necessarily matter that much to those who are who are trying to live in that world and get an advantage.
Right.
In that world.
I mean, what it makes me think of is George Furness's idea of generalized drugs. That as humans, we are these evolved biological machines that we don't actually sense things directly. We sense things by proxy. We don't actually sense, is there calories in this thing? We sense, it's sweet or it has fat in it. Or we don't actually sense, is that a healthy mate? But we have, measures of symmetry and so on. So we're always using these indirect measures of stuff that supposedly, or in the state of nature, correlated with this underlying value, which is what we're trying to bet on. We're trying to bet on the underlying value, but instead all we have is these proxies that we can sense. And as a result, there's always an exploitation opportunity to make something which satisfies the proxy, but is not actually leading to the underlying good for the organism. And it seems like the whole memes and the propaganda and all that is kind of that process again. Absolutely. That we say, if everybody's saying it, it must be true. That's another one of these proxy things. Or forget about true. If everybody's doing it, I should do it. Put it that way, and then don't even, like that.
Absolutely. That's
what to
a very good
do
point.
About that?
Well, let's take a step back for a second. So, Phil, I don't feel like I introduced you quite properly. So can you say a little bit about what's your job title and so forth? I know you're like the director of a center that seems particularly relevant to this. I'd be curious as to what that center actually, is doing day to day.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a professor, actually now a distinguished professor of informatics and computer science at Indiana University.
It's better to be a distinguished professor than an extinguished professor.
Absolutely. They often follow each other closely, but yes, and as you said, I'm the director of the Observatory on Social Media, which is a center here. It's a collaboration between our school, the Ladi School of Informatics, and the Media School, and the Network Science Institute. So we have an interdisciplinary group of people. Some of us are computer scientists, some of us are physicists, some of us are journalists, and some of us are network scientists, and some of us are a mixture of these things. And we sort of are interested in all sorts of different aspects of how information spreads online, how media affects people's perceptions of truths and facts, and how the media landscape is changing, and how narratives spread and evolve online. What we can do about it. We develop some tools as well to help people, for example, detect social bots online, or visualize how information spreads, or what is the role of coordinated groups in
now. Is that something that you monitor
narratives. Kind
of proactively, or are you kind of? I know you have there's an observatory that you're associated with, right? And so what have you been observing? What do we know about what's going on right now?
Yeah. So that's our center is called Observatory on Social Media, and so some of our tools are specifically designed to help people analyze what's going on, whether it's collect data, visualize it, use machine learning to categorize different behaviors that you can observe online. So for example, we have a tool called Botometer, and you can use it to take an account, or better, a group of accounts, and look at whether there is a likelihood that there is some automation among these accounts, that some of these accounts may not be authentic. And we also develop machine learning tools to look at large information diffusion networks and detect subsets of nodes, of accounts that are likely coordinated, right? That they have some similarity that is statistically surprising, right? It's unlikely that so many people would be so similar to each other. For example, would tweet exactly the same sequence of hashtags, or would retweet exactly the same set of tweets, or would tweet phrases and sentences that are so identical to each other, or things of that nature. So we can look at patterns where suspicious types of behaviors can lead us to detect some kind of abuse. And so visualization is another piece of it. We have another tool called Hoaxy that you can type it a hashtag or a link to a news article or a username or a phrase, and you can see how that spreads among people. So it sort of extracts data from Twitter and builds a diffusion network, who retweets whom, who mentions whom, so that you can identify who are the important players, which are the influential nodes, and do bots play a role in these dynamics? Why do certain things go viral and others do not? And who are those people? What else are they saying? Can we identify the super spreaders? So there's lots of interesting questions that come about using data from social media to study, the information dynamics on this interesting complex system which is constantly evolving. We have another tool called BotSlayer, which is just a piece of software that anybody can use to set up their own infrastructure in the cloud and get a lot of data from Twitter, and then monitor what are the new narratives, what hashtags are trending, and what links are all of a sudden become popular in a suspicious way, in the sense that they may be supported by inauthentic accounts or by coordinated accounts. So the idea is to help journalists and civil society organizations, or even citizens, monitor and understand what's going on. To all of us now, this seems trite, but think that we started doing this in 2010, when people hadn't even thought that social media could be abused and manipulated, and that's when we found the first instances of social bots, and we came up with this term, social bots. That's from us. And we also found the first instances of fake news website, these websites that at that time were purely there to spread completely fabricated claims and make money from ads. So it was for purely financial purposes, and we demonstrated for the first time how you could make money that way. I created the first fake news website in 2006 and got a check in the mail from Google.
Fault.
Well, I don't think so, but at least it was the demonstration that it could be done. And I got a check in the mail from Google to prove that you could create completely made up information. It was an algorithm generated random stuff, and you could say, give me news about Michael and Dave, and it would just generate a fake news saying Michael and Dave were arrested for DUI last night in a nightclub in Paris, or some crazy stuff like that. Put some ads on it and got money. So that demonstrated how these systems could be vulnerable. Or from phishing. We showed how the first social phishing attack, where you could use information about who's friends with whom to create emails that appear to generate from your friends and to get you to divulge your password, for example. And these are the things that are used these days. Phishing attacks.
Sure.
Russians, for example, use this trick to get to the Podesta emails, which led into the Pizzagate scandal and the QAnon stories that are happening now. So so the observatory is really looking at all different ways in which our online environments are vulnerable and can make us do things that are against our interests.
Is there anything happening now that we don't know about?
Oh, there's a lot of stuff happening all the time. Our latest. The latest thing that we just put on the archive just a couple of days ago is a study of so-called political trains. So you probably have heard about Twitter follow trains, right? And so this is a technique used on social media like Twitter to for a group of entities to collaboratively evade limits set by the platforms. So I can accumulate followers by following other people and then having them follow you back. And to prevent spam, platforms have rules that say, if you follow more than 5,000 people, then you should have comparable number of followers. And so there is entities that kind of control in a hierarchical fashion this kind of behavior. We call them trained conductors. They post these really long lists of accounts, and then all of the followers automatically follow them. And so then they follow the other people. And so this is a way to grow a massive, we could call it echo chamber, a very dense network. It's also very deep and hierarchically structured.
To avoid the platform rules.
Checks, yes, but also
or to
gain
satisfy
a lot
the
of
rules.
Power.
But, yeah.
It becomes an enormous megaphone. So now anybody in this network can post the latest false narratives or latest claim, or can say that I don't know that there is voter fraud, or your conspiracy theory of the day. And now you will have automatically thousands or tens of thousands of accounts that will retweet that. A lot of these accounts automatically just retweet everything that gets posted. And they post huge volumes, like thousands of tweets per day. And then they delete them to avoid detection after a while, after they've done what they were supposed to do.
Right.
So that if you look at that
they get
account,
outside the hierarchy, and then the hierarchy dumps them, but they're still out there.
Yeah, it's out there now. If you look at my account, I can say, I'm fine. So there's this massive manipulation efforts, and it works quite well. These echo chambers, these networks are enormous, and they're very efficient from a network information diffusion perspective. They're very efficient because they have these super dense cores, where as soon as somebody posts something, then a very large number of people are exposed to it. So it spreads super, super fast.
So is there a small center of people or accounts that have the right to inject the new ones? I mean, there needs to be a control of some sort.
Yes. That's why we call them conductors and writers.
I see.
And the conductors are the ones, and they are actually different. We look at their behaviors, and you can characterize the differences between them in looking at the structure of their social networks, and in looking at the behaviors and the amount of followers and friends that they have, and how actively they post, or how many things they delete, and so on. So we do really have this sort of hierarchical structure, and some accounts are in charge, and they just sort of tell everybody, go and follow all of these accounts. So you can create a bunch of fake accounts, you can buy them, or you can just run them through a bot or whatever, and it's super easy to program, so that whenever you see that anybody in this list of people posts a list, you just automatically follow all of them. So this is actually a very efficient way to amplify narratives, and it is used. And sometimes you have politicians, very, very influential politicians, who retweet the things that are posted by these trained accounts.
I mean, on the one hand, Twitter or Facebook, whatever it is, they could take a much harder line on transparency, on linking to underlying causes, if not underlying individual people. But that's bad for their business. That's bad for their subscriber counts. And so it's in their interest to build a platform that is vulnerable to this kind of stuff, at least to some point of view. I mean, if we can get up to a sort of a higher level, a sort of making a more general moral judgment that if you're going to be playing with this kind of megaphone amplification power, then you have a responsibility to do more contact tracing, more something to let you do it. I don't, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems to me in an evolutionary sense like it's going to just be an arms race no matter what. And, if your observatory figures out that there's a new thing that's happening this way, or if Twitter knows that it is a 5,000 person limit, well, then they'll do 4,999
and that's what they do.
And so on. Mm-hmm. And so none of those sort of technological patches are going to change the game. They might make, on the margin, they might make differences, but the bigger problem is going to remain.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And that limit of 5,000, just to, sorry, small technical point, you can go beyond it, but only if you have equal number of followers. So I cannot follow 5,000 people and have only 1,000 followers. But if I can get 5,000 followers, now I can follow another 1,000 and so on. And so you look at the distribution of the ratio between exactly. You look at the distribution of the ratio of followers to friends for these accounts, and it's extremely peaked at 1. So you know that it's artificial.
Because Twitter is using these proxy hacks,
exactly,
that, which
and so they adapt.
Bots exploit that.
It's like an ecological niche, like you adapt to whatever is the rule of the environment, and right. You find a way to trick it. So you're right, it's an arms race, and to some extent that's inevitable. And to be honest, though, to give credit, the platforms are becoming more aggressive lately, in part because they've been criticized a lot, and they're going after some of the, let's say, the most patent abuses, whether it is misinformation that is harmful about the election or about the pandemic, or whether it is automated They've become very aggressive in taking down social bots, but in other ways they are hesitant because they also get criticized for political censorship when they take down accounts that tend to be more on one side than the other. But you know what? The abuse, not only our research, but that of many, many, many others in this area, shows that these abuses are not symmetric. And yes, people on the right and on the left are vulnerable, and yes, people on the right and on the left do abuse, but not to the same extent. And so if the platform then goes after the abuse, they are likely to be easily labeled as doing some kind of political, censorship. Even our own research group,
that it's partisan because there is an imbalance in the perpetrators.
When we found the first instances of social bots and fake news websites, back in 2010, these tended to be mostly from the right. And so we published papers about it, and a few years later, we came under political attack by politicians and partisan news sources like Fox News and so on, who said, this is politically motivated research. Ugh. And I don't even want to go into that. Yeah. It's a sad chapter of my life that took 6 months of my life. But so platforms are right now criticized from both sides. On the one side, the liberals say you should do more to take down abuse, or to fact check things, or to limit the spread of harmful misinformation. And on the other side, they have politicians who say, oh, you are censoring conservative speech. And so they are.
And then there's the pro-bot Americans, who believe that they themselves are being censored.
Oh, you
at least they say it a lot.
Yes, I'm being censored. You're being censored. I'm being censored. Hey, are you?
Well, at the time when we were under attack, and we said, but look, we're looking after these deceptive, inauthentic accounts that claim to be somebody that they're not. And then some people said, oh, but it's my freedom of speech to why can't I create 1,000 bots? That's my freedom of speech. And of course, platforms then made rules to say that these kind of inauthentic, deceptive behaviors is against their rules. But then now there are politicians who say that they should revise Section 230 to make it harder for them to do certainly that's policing of their platforms.
That's one of the things I think about. I mean, there used to be the fact that you had the FCC gave you airwaves, gave you bandwidth, incurred an obligation because that was a public good. And so you were supposed to be responsible in your use of it. And one could certainly imagine an analog to that in the internet. If you're going to have so much amplification power, you have an obligation to this public good. We're not in that kind of world these days. Doesn't mean we couldn't push back towards that.
Yeah. And in fact, there is some push towards reform. Right now, the politicians are divided. They all say that something should be done, but what they think should be done is completely opposite. But if you put the partisanship aside from a moment, you could imagine some revision of Section 230.
Can you? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Let's pretend that Dave knows what that means, but I don't.
So the Telecommunication Decency Act has a section 230 that says that platforms, technology platforms that are allowing people to post their own messages online are not liable for the content that is posted by the users, except for some cases, for example, child pornography or terrorism or things like that, where they are supposed to take that information down. But otherwise, they can police their platforms as they please, and they can be sued for opinions or posted by their users. And this has been really important for the emergence of major social media platforms. They all probably would not exist without that section 230. And that means that platforms can, apply rules as they see fit. And early on, when we started pointing out how they were being abused, their reaction was, no, it's fine, and sure, there may be some stuff, but it'll sort itself out. People will figure out what's true and what's false and what's reliable and what's not reliable. And then things got worse because, of course, it's difficult for people to figure that out. And plus, there is explicit manipulation. And so then now, reluctantly, platforms have started to more aggressively police their platforms. But now, as we said, they are under attack from the other side. So there are people who say that Section 230 should be revisited. Either, conservative people say to make it harder for platforms to police their platforms when it comes to harmful misinformation. Liberals say that that they should actually be required to do this. And maybe there is some reasonable medium where, government is not supposed to decide what's true or what's false. I mean, that's the First Amendment, right? But perhaps it could create guidelines that platforms could follow so that they don't run afoul of they don't get accused of themselves performing, political censorship. And so we could have definitions of what is harmful misinformation and what are cases when, when platforms can, police their platforms without, being accused of political censorship. So we are, this is all stuff that is evolving, and we are in the middle of it, and we don't know exactly what will happen, but it is certainly a very hot topic of political debate these days. In fact, we are very interested. We did some research to look at whether platforms had some kind of political bias in their algorithms. And so we developed some bots that were designed to try to detect whether there was this kind of political bias. And it turns out that the algorithms that rank things in your news feed are not really politically biased at all. They're very neutral. Despite that, because of the ecosystem itself and the asymmetric activity of political actors on different sides, there is a very strong bias in the environment. And so these drifter bots that are just doing stuff at random easily drift from the left to the center, from the center to the right, simply because there is such uneven levels of activity from different sides of the political spectrum.
And then you look to see like what gets suspended or what gets pushed onto other people's feeds and so on, and then you can infer distributions over political sensibilities from these things. Well, that's a useful idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that account, that Twitter account that just automatically tweets whatever Trump tweets, to see whether they get shut down for saying what he wasn't getting shut down for saying.
Exactly,
like
that would be a type of censor. Exactly, so that's the kind of thing that we're exploring.
Well, so are we screwed? Is there hope here? I mean, what do you see? What does the future look like for society, humans, internet, agent, network? What do you think?
That's $1 million question. I get asked that question a lot, and I have to respond with my gut rather than with our research, because research-wise things could go in every possible direction, and so much will hinge on policy decisions and regulatory decisions that have nothing to do with the kind of science that we do. So my answer is a gut answer, and I'm an optimist. So I want to hope that things will get better, and so I grasp for examples of that, and I think that every technology that has ever been introduced in the history of the world has had good applications and bad applications, and certain. Even focusing on communication technologies, that has certainly been good, right? From the press to the telegraph and the telephone and newspapers, and every time that there was this technology, it was hailed as, oh yes, great, it will make the world perfect. And then later on we realized that, oh, it could be misused and it's bad. And then people said, oh, it's gonna be terrible, it's gonna ruin the world. And and people were worried during the telephone that people wouldn't read anymore.
Right.
And so, in fact, we are, if you think that, social media are only, 15 years old or something like that, they're still a relatively new technology. And our social norms and our intellectual capability to deal with them, as well as the technology themselves, we are changing all the time. Every day Facebook and Twitter announce new policies, new algorithms, new ways to take down that or detect that, or decide what's okay and what's not okay. So everything is changing very, very fast, and so we are in the middle of it. So if we zoom out, my hope is that in maybe, probably not tomorrow, but maybe in 10 or 20 years, we might think of social media just like we think today of the telephone, or there are some problems, or email, spam still exists, and we get annoying robocalls on our phone, but still we use our phone, and
it doesn't feel like it's destroying democracy.
It's
right?
not destroying, exactly. We still use email. There is spam and there is crap, but it's still kind of a useful tool.
Right.
And so
but there's got to be
learn.
There's got to be a pivot somewhere in there, though, right? Because I feel like the path that we're on with social media is really unhealthy. So one thing that occurs to me, you mentioned that the kind of timing in terms of how long this has been around. The people who were in like middle school when this first appeared were really deeply affected, I would argue, by this technology, and it really changed their experience of growing up in a way that that was different than it was for us.
Yeah,
those people now are like your seniors in college and your graduate students. What do you see with them? Do they seem to have the fire and the insight and the desire to like make this a force for good, or at least a force for like just neutral?
I think that for sure there young people tend to be idealistic, and certainly I see a lot of interest in making things better, for sure. But I think what's more important is that because they're still young now, that the harms of this technology are being better understood, I think they are more conscious and more aware. And so that's one of hopefully some good outcome of our research, is to have created awareness. And so now when I talk to kids that are in my undergraduate courses, they all are aware about bots, and they know that social media can be harmful, and so hopefully they, the next generation will be somewhat slightly more immune or inoculated from the worst of this kind of abuse in ways that our generation was not. Because we were somewhat naive in some sense, and we hadn't yet appreciated, the kind of harm that could come from it. So, regulation will probably play a role. Technological improvements will play a role. There is a lot of interesting research in AI to detect harm and to detect misinformation, or even to develop tools to help fact checkers so that we can scale up fact checking. And maybe we can come up with algorithms to determine trustworthy sources, so that they, just like we have pretty good spam detectors on our email clients these days, and most of that spam doesn't make it into our inbox. Maybe in a few years, most of this crap of conspiracy theories and junk science and hyper political content won't make it into our news feed of our Facebook and Twitter feed. And maybe that will be the next technology, the next social media platform that will take over, Facebook will be one which has figured out how to take out a lot of the pollution from our information environment. So in that sense, I want to be optimistic that a mixture of regulation and technology and also education will get us out of this big bad hole that we're in now, and in the future this will be just another one of those things that are there, and hopefully they're useful, and they're not perfect, and we just understand that.
Well, thank you so much for working on this stuff and for sharing your perspective on it with us. I think I really do think it's important, and I think that I like your positive take on how we might kind of get past this. Though it would be nice if we could just wave a magic wand now, but it's going to be a slog. We
are doing it. It's just that it's really slow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's right. Yeah, Phil, I really enjoyed this conversation. It almost gives me hope in the world that we're living in today, and that's about as good as we can hope for. So thanks a lot.
Thank you guys for having me. This has been really fun.
This was Computing Up. Thanks for listening.